This morning, I would like for us to begin in a different way. I hope that you'll indulge me, and I hope that my reason will make sense by the end of the sermon. But today I want to begin with 30 seconds of silence. Thank you. There was a time in my life when that would have terrified me. I would have been thinking all sorts of things. I would have wondered, I bet he didn't write a sermon and he's trying to think of something right now. Or I would have thought, I hope he's timing this. Hope he doesn't go too far over. I would have wondered what the people around me were thinking. Silence was difficult for me. What if I had asked for 2 minutes of silence? I get it, trust me. Silence, especially in a group, requires a level of trust and surrender that doesn't come naturally to us. Noise and activity help us feel like we're in control. And if real silence lasts long enough, all that stuff that we try to keep pushed down, that we don't want to think about, will start coming up to the surface. And so we keep the music going, we keep the internet surfing going as much as we can. We want to be distracted. There was a time in my life, as I told you, that would have been the worst thing in the world, silence. I had a lot of grief over the death of my dad, over the loss of my childhood faith community. They were things I didn't want to think about. And our parish had a Taizé service once a month, which I loved. I especially loved the meal after the Taizé service, but I loved the dark, I loved the candlelight, I loved the music. I didn't like the 5 minutes of silence they had instead of a sermon. The first time I sat through that, it felt like 2 hours. I was turning around and looking at the musicians, wondering if one of them had fallen asleep, whoever was supposed to keep the clock. But I knew it was good for me. I knew all through Scripture it says we find God in silence, so I kept doing it. And eventually, I wished it was longer. Okay, now are you ready for the worst transition in the history of sermon transitions? Here we go. Speaking of silence, today is Christ the King Sunday. What does silence have to do with Christ the King Sunday or our gospel reading? Well, I'm glad that you asked. And I will tell you, but first, I need to say this. When Pilate meets Jesus, he was told the reason this man was in trouble was he thinks he's a king. And so Pilate made all sorts of assumptions about this man, Jesus. He assumes he means to take his throne by overthrowing the current king, either Herod's child, or Pilate or Caesar, because this is how new dynasties are established. 200 years before Jesus met Pilate, a guy named Judas Maccabeus raised an army of farmers, and they defeated the Syrians, which was the largest army in the world, and he had a new dynasty established in his name. About 30 years before this time, Herod the Great led an army, defeated the Parthians, and Rome, as a reward, made him king of the Jews, even though he had no pedigree for that office. And so this is the kind of man Pilate is expecting to meet when he walks into his throne room to meet Jesus. And instead he finds a poor man from the wrong part of the country. He finds a man with a small group of followers, true, but they've all abandoned him. This man cannot be king. At least not the kind of king Pilate's used to. He's certainly not the kind of political leader we're used to. No one expected a king who's homeless at the time of his birth, the child of an unwed mother. Kings spend their time courting the rich and the powerful. They don't spend their time with the lowest in society. Kings bring peace with the sword. They don't tell their followers to turn the other cheek and pray for their enemy. Kings gather armies around them because they're great and they've risen above birth through conquest. But Jesus says, the greatest among you will be your servant. Jesus confirms all of Pilate's suspicions about him when he says, my kingdom is not of this world or from this world. If it were, my followers would fight. This is the kind of king Pilate cannot understand. Pilate is assuming a way of being king completely opposite of the way Jesus is king. And so all of that leads me to what silence has to do with Christ the King Sunday. I believe that silence, especially the Christian discipline of prayerful silence, provides a good metaphor for understanding the kind of kingship we find in Jesus. And that is first because silence, like the kingship we see in Jesus, forces us to look at ourselves with honest eyes. A former teacher of mine named Randy Harris wanted to find out what would happen if he got silent. During his sabbatical from Abilene Christian University, he decided to go spend 40 days with monks in a Catholic monastery taking a vow of silence. And he said he was terrified. He had no background that would make him the ideal candidate to do something like this. He said he was terrified because he assumed one of two things might happen. First, nothing would happen. He'd find out we're all alone in this world, or he had just wasted 40 days of his life. Second, even worse, something would happen. God would start messing with him, in his words. And he said the second thing happened. He said at first it was just a lot of tedium and boredom. The monks pray 8 times a day for 6 hours total of prayer every day. And he didn't even know their names, and it wouldn't have helped him if he did because he couldn't say them. But he said eventually he found a rhythm, and all the stuff he had been pushing down just came to the surface. And he's forced in silence to deal with all of that stuff. And he found as he started emotionally dealing with it, God showed up. In the same way, Jesus tells Pilate, my kingdom is not from this world, or my followers would fight. Randy Harris was forced through silence to deal with a bunch of stuff he didn't want to deal with, to surrender. He said after 40 days of silence, he walked away with a deep sense that God loved him, and there was nothing he could do to make God love him more. And so he would stop trying to fix himself. Didn't mean he didn't have a lot to do. It just meant God would not love him more because he did it. If it were of this world, my followers would be fighting. I think this is the most ignored statement of Jesus in Scripture. Because we really like to fight and argue, especially when we think we're right or we're defending truth. And if we could somehow know with 100% certainty that everything we're saying and believing is right from God, then we might have a place to begin an argument from. But the truth is we can't. It's striking that Pilate says, "What is truth?" But truth is standing right in front of him. Jesus is innocent. Jesus is right. Jesus does not defend. In fact, he seems to be saying that if you were to defend him with the sword, it would prove he wasn't who he said he was. What if our need to fight has more to do with confusing truth and rightness with our need to be seen as knowing the truth and our need to be seen as being right? Here's the big point. In this story, we see two ways of being king come face to face. In Pilate, we see all the power of Rome and Caesar. In Jesus, we see God's kingdom of self-sacrificial love. And somehow, we have to get up every morning and decide which kingdom we're going to live under. Whose rules will we follow today? And it would be simple. If every morning we were woken up by Pilate and Jesus, imagine them shaking you in your bed, and Pilate has a cup of coffee for you, and I'm sure Jesus is holding the Book of Common Prayer, right? Surely. And whichever you choose to take is how you're going to live that day. But unfortunately, we don't have that. Instead, we have an alarm that wakes most of us up. When our feet hit the floor, the race begins, and we don't stop until our head hits the pillow. Shakespeare wrote in Macbeth, Act 5, Scene 5, that life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. In other words, we're too distracted to even think about it. That's why we need silence. I'm in no way saying that busyness is a sin, but I am saying if we live only that way, we're going to fall into a trap. This week it's come back to me over and over again how much silence and God have in common. Mainly because many of us do whatever we can to avoid both. And both of them force us to deal with things we don't want to deal with. Seeking either of them will force us to live in a way that's different than everyone else around us. Embracing either requires us to surrender control and trust. So may we seek our King in silence.